participation with us tonight. In the latter half, we're going to break out into discussion groups to talk, and which we will engage with a exercise that Miranda has designed for us today. And then we're going to close in and come back to the main group and just to offer insights and closing remarks. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, this is our launch of our mutual aid best practice discussion series. This is really a space that we're creating now. Our hope is that it's a space for community members to come together, to share information, also share skills with each other and knowledge with one another. We also hope that this is a space where we can discuss organizing tactics and strategies with one another. We also want to be able to share our stories with one another, whether that be personal or collective stories, and we want to build new stories together here. We also want to make sure that this space is a space that we can keep in touch. And so we always know every Tuesday, hopefully this session will go past April, but this is a place we always can go to. We want to make sure, if you'll see here, there's a registration form, and I believe NAM is going to put the link to the registration form in the chat box. This series, we're also hoping to incorporate through the registration form. You can actually share about what skills you would like to offer other people. So if you have this particular skill or expertise that you would like to share with your community members, let us know, and we'll help you organize a discussion around that. Also, if there's a particular skill or a new set of knowledge that you would like to learn about and you're not quite sure how to access it, let us know through the registration form and we'll try to organize it for you. And lastly, everyone is welcome. So please tell your friends, share widely in your networks. Okay, in terms of our community agreements, these are just the ways that we want to be together. These are good tips to remember as we engage with one another so that we can build a space that's really healthy and that we all feel respected and cared for together. And so the first tip is, the first community agreement is one diva, one mic. That means really, one person speaks at a time. Also make space and take space. So be really mindful about the way you're taking up space, the way you are in space. So if you're a person that tends to be a little bit more timid and takes a step back, challenge yourself to take up a little bit more space. Also, if you're a person that's really confident and really feels comfortable taking space, this is a good time to just go back a little bit and allow other people to take some space. Also, oops and outs. This is a great process. So if you've said something that you realize afterwards that it can be actually harmful, or it can be taken in a way that actually impacts people in a negative way, you can say oops. That allows us to open up the conversation about what was said and really build a better understanding and a better relationship. And then ouch. So if you hear something that you realize is really challenging and hurtful, you can start a conversation by saying ouch. That really lets folks know that that no harm was intended, but that we need to stop for a moment to build better understanding. Also be mindful of time. We have only 2 hours today and lots to get through, so let's stay on topic. Also, I love this one. No one knows everything, but together we know a lot. And that is something that I learn every single time I gather with community members. Awareness of power and privilege. So really be mindful of how you're treating each other, how others are treating you. For myself, my name's Ana Teresa. I'm in the participants tab. I will put a star beside my name. So if you feel that somebody has said something that crosses the line, please do let me know as one of the organizers, and I will follow up with that. Patience and respect. So let's be patient and respectful to one another as we engage on this topic, on all future topics. No topic is worth having if it's not controversial, if it's not challenging, and if it doesn't push us to unlearn and learn together. Also, please note, again, we will be recording the session. Okay, so I'm going to go into a bit of a Zoom check just to go do an overview of how we're going to engage over Zoom. It is a new platform. So if you see the mic here, when people are presenting, we ask that people unmute themselves. That just prevents any background noise, and that was almost perfect timing. Also, when we get into the group discussion, feel free to unmute yourself so you can participate a little bit more freely. In terms of the cameras, keep on camera, especially during the latter half of the session where we're going to go into breakout groups. But if you're having instability with your Wi-Fi, take yourself off camera. That will stabilize it. Also, this participants tab here, we have now, if I see, we have about 12 participants here today. Welcome, everyone. This participants tab is a great place for you to go in and rename yourself. You can also put a raise your hand here in the participants tab. The chat box. The chat box is one of the biggest places where we can participate. So in the chat box, you're going to see links that we added. We already put the registration form for this discussion series into the chat box. A really great thing is if you have a question when the presentation is going on and you don't want to interrupt the presentation, put in the chat box. We have a chat moderator that's going to keep track of all of that. Also, if there's something you really agree with, we like to build consensus by you putting +1 into the chat box. If there's something, again, that pushes your buttons in ways that can be harmful, remember, you can put ouch there as well. Okay, so just in terms of the participants tab, when you go into the participants tab, you should be able to find a drop-down menu. And in that drop-down menu, you can rename yourself. Renaming yourself is great. The reason why is because it's just better for us to engage with each other. Also, you can add your pronouns. That would be really helpful. Okay, one last thing, I think this is the last thing that I have to do just in terms of the check is the gallery view. So when we're not in presentation mode, at the end of this session, we're going to get together in one main room. In that main room, we're going to have a chance to do a debrief from the breakout and from the exercise that Miranda designed for us today. Stay in gallery view and put yourself on camera. This is the way we're going to be able to connect. Okay, so I'm now going to pass it off and pass it up to Miranda Black, who's our guest speaker for today, and she will introduce herself. Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, Miranda.
Hi, everyone. Teresa, could we stay on the introduction first? Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Miranda, and my pronouns are she, her. I am a Davenport resident, and I am Mohawk of the Bay of Quinte, and I'm also part White Settler. Originally, my people were called Kanyigeha, but Mohawk is a name that was given to us by settlers and is stuck for generations now. I am an Onwe person, which translates to an original or indigenous person. And my people are part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is a group of 6 nations: the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora. Haudenosaunee translates to people of the Longhouse, as longhouses were the original structures of the Iroquois people. I'm also half white settler, which means that my family settled here after colonial contact with Indigenous peoples. I am a water activist, as water is very sacred and has a very sacred meaning to Indigenous people and is necessary for life on this planet. I just want to say that I'm very thankful for all of you coming to the workshop today. We're going to deep dive into quite a lot of topics. A lot of this might be new territory for quite a few of you, and then others, it's just knowledge. When it comes to Indigenous issues, especially Indigenous issues in Toronto, there's often a disconnect. When we give a land acknowledgement, often we're talking about the people whose territory that land was, but the disconnect within time, that the land isn't a long back belonging to Indigenous peoples. Right now, it is called inherent, it's an inherent right of Indigenous peoples. So I'm also a master's student at Ryerson University, where I'm bringing Native science and Indigenous-led environmental management into water conservation. It's quite difficult for me to be able to do this work because I'm in a department that values and prioritizes Western scientific knowledge. So I've definitely faced a lot of criticism while doing my work. Prior to colonial contact, Indigenous people had wealths of science, and it's often said as environmental stewardship. But it's so much more than that. There's a lot of skills that you get from looking at the land for thousands of years, understanding migration patterns, understanding how people connect, and also the human interaction with the land. It's a very different thing than what's happening now. I also work at Ryerson as a research assistant to a project focused on Indigenous health research and the factors that lead to excessive homelessness rates for Indigenous youth. I'm mentioning my academic life because it's really important to my journey. I'm like a lot of urban Indigenous youth in Canada. I faced houselessness at a very young age. I dropped out of high school. I was uncertain of where I belonged, and I was disconnected from my heritage. So, and as time went by, my elders, who I was connected to on Tyendinaga, my family's territory, passed away, and it left a gap between me and my culture. So I've been using the privilege of university to reconnect with my culture and strengthen my understanding of my indigeneity and my sense of belonging. It's been a 7-year journey so far, and it's definitely brought me down through a lot of paths that I did not see myself going through or going down. I definitely have to say that university is a privilege, and that I'm using that privilege to strengthen Indigenous rights and incorporate Indigenous voices into urban development consultation processes. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. Last slide, please. Thank you. So I'd first like to start with a land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge that Toronto is built upon the traditional lands of the Mississauga, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, the Huron, and I'd like to change that to say the Wendat, and many other Indigenous peoples. I'd like to acknowledge that Canada was founded as a trade and commerce economy that continues to affect the lives and well-being of Indigenous peoples, putting economic greed in front of Indigenous rights. For that reason, I would like to recognize that the invaluable work happening in the Mutual Aid's Pod project, as it's based in the Indigenous cultural worldview of kinship, taking care of your community, and giving what you have to others who may have less. Although we're doing this work on Toronto soil, it's important to acknowledge that there is a long way to go before conciliation can occur between the City of Toronto and Indigenous peoples. Finally, I would like to acknowledge that many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island live in Toronto. I would like to value their diversity of cultural worldviews, their resiliency, and their ties to their community. Next slide, please. Great. I'd like to just start this session with a little bit of history of where Toronto now stands. There are many land cessions and purchases in the Toronto, Hamilton, and Niagara regions of Southern Ontario. Out of these regions, only one is supported by a modern land claim, and that's exactly where Toronto now stands. If you look at the map, it's showcased here in orange, and that is the Toronto purchase. To the right of that is the Rouge Park land claim, and that is a Mississauga of the credit. And currently that is an unsettled land claim. So many of these purchases were completed by representatives of the Crown just prior to the War of 1812 against the Americans. These cessions happened on Indian land after the Royal Proclamation of 1763. If these cessions or purchases happen today, many of them would be seen as illegitimate, as the Crown did not present these claims in Indigenous languages and used their own laws to settle negotiations. Therefore, Indigenous people did not know what they were signing to or how it would affect their communities for so many generations. So in 2010, the Toronto purchase ended and the Mississauga of the credit ended their 25-year battle for the modern land claim of York. So it's a long history. But in the end, the Mississauga of the credit were paid $145 million for the land. The city of Toronto makes $11.8 billion in revenue per year. And for the 150 years that Canada has been an institution and Toronto has been a city, the Mississauga were only paid $145 million for that land. Toronto makes $11.8 billion in revenue through transportation. They also through land tax. And plus there's a lot of sectors that do business on this land. None of the revenue from these businesses go to Indigenous peoples, unless of course they're Indigenous built businesses. Another modern land claim, so the Rouge Park land claim that I've just introduced in the light pink, was submitted in 2015, but hasn't yet been settled. Just east of the Rouge Tract claim are the Williams Treaty lands. They were claimed in 1920. So even though these treaties happened more recently, they've caused Indigenous peoples a lot of pain, even though you might think because they were done in 1920, it might have been a more equitable process, but it wasn't. In 2018, the treaties were finally settled as the Chippewa and also the Mississauga had a lot of complaints to the Crown. And Carolyn Bennett, the Ministry of Indigenous Affairs, gave a formal apology to the Mississauga and the Chippewa peoples who live on that land. Many of the issues are around fishing and hunting rights, which are Aboriginal rights as seen in Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution. Next slide, please. So I wanted to bring to you the idea of the two-row wampum, which is the first wampum that was created on this territory and between the Europeans and the Indigenous peoples. Wampums are culturally appropriate ways to make agreements with Indigenous peoples on land, who were on this land at the time. They're a visual representation of a treaty. They're made of blue and white shell beads. The wampum was used traditionally by the Haudenosaunee, but many Indigenous groups since European contact use this method of treaty making. The first wampum was a two-row wampum, and that was in between the Europeans and the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch in the early 1600s. The two-row wampum is really important as it's the first treaty in between these two groups. The three white stripes are said to represent purity, good mind, and peace. However, I've heard different representations too. The two purple lines are the Indigenous peoples and the Europeans. It's said that each of these peoples were in boats going downstream, but respecting each other's cultures and practices. This is how relationships in between peoples was supposed to be left if colonial settlers valued these treaties. But what happened on this land did not respect these agreements. Next slide, please. So Toronto recognizes that an Indigenous name for this land is Takarano, which is the Mohawk word for where the trees stand in water. In the city's land acknowledgement, they acknowledge the land by this name, but also acknowledge this land as home to the Mississauga of the Credit, who lived on this territory prior to the Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The Mississauga names for this land are seen in this map here. This is from a book by, I forget actually the author's name, but it was about a reverend who was also a historian, and he was a Mississaugan person, and he also was a historian. So the Mississauga names for this land, there were three of where York now stands. I may not be pronouncing these right, as from what I hear from elders of the Mississauga, there hasn't been a person who's spoken their traditional language since the 1920s. But I'm pretty sure that it's Kopechenok for the Humber River and the land around the Humber River, Wansconchinach for the John River, and then also Menacing on the islands. So that would be the Toronto Islands, which are really important, three very important spaces for the Mississauga and their understanding of the land. And the reason why these lands were actually around the waters is because the Mississauga were canoe people first. Toronto was originally called the Carrying Place Trail, and it went from the base of the Humber to Lake Ontario, all the way up to Lake Superior. And that was a very well-traveled route for Indigenous peoples prior to colonialism. Even after first contact, that was a very important trade route for a long time. I'd also like to mention that a lot of the words in Ontario are similar to Mohawk words, like Toronto and Toronto. And this is because of a British allyship that the Mohawk had when forming the country. Prior to the War of 1812, there was a very tight relationship between the Mohawk people and European settlers. So I wanted to bring up some of the Toronto's relationship to Indigenous peoples. The city itself, oh, I can hear someone's mic. The city itself is an interesting one because there's, when it comes to Indigenous issues, a lot of things are swept under a rug. And this happens across Canada. And a lot of this is very deep. And so I don't want to rush through it because it might be a lot for new learners to come to understand or so forth. But Toronto's relationship to Indigenous peoples and 7 things that you may want to know. So in Toronto, Indigenous people have been forced out of their homelands, and many Indigenous peoples face houselessness in their home territory. So the idea of houselessness rather than homelessness is because this land is their traditional home. Therefore, people cannot be homeless in your home territory. This is going to make sense of the immense amount of homeless Indigenous rates across Canada, but especially in Toronto. Number 2, Indigenous people are still here, even due to systemic oppression. They're not able to live here. So as an example, there are 250 homes on Toronto Island. And even though this is a sacred site to the Mississauga and many other Indigenous groups, they're not allowed to live there because unless you go through the same lottery process as settlers, you don't have a right to one of those homes. So this happens in many ways due to property rights across Canada. Number 3, although this land is the inherent right of Indigenous peoples, many people are unable to visit their sacred sites, such as the Toronto Island or Petroglyph Provincial Park near Peterborough. So if an Indigenous person would like to visit these places, they still need to use the same way that a settler person would get to that site, whether that's driving their car or paying the fee for a provincial park, or paying for one of the water taxis or boat services to Toronto Island. And because of so many inequities, this money isn't always available to be able to do these trips to their sacred sites. Another one is that development verbs have historically mowed over artifacts and grave sites of Indigenous peoples when building in Toronto and the surrounding area. As an example of this, in Stillville, which is north of Toronto, where developers found a whole settlement underneath the ground while they were digging. There's an amazing report that was written on what they were able to find. But the development company wanted them to just continue work and not document this. Luckily, some of the workers made notes and drawings before going ahead and doing that work. And historians were able to pull together all of that information into some amazing reports. Throughout history, Indigenous children have been taken from their homes. And I think a lot of us are learning these types of things with Orange Shirt Day, or just understanding what happened with the residential school system or the 60s scoop. I just want to add that when I was growing up, we didn't talk about these things in my home. We didn't know a lot of these things. And that's because we weren't talking about it yet. It really wasn't until 2015 that we started talking about these issues in Canada, even though it was in 1847, the first, the act that created the residential school system was brought forward. I'd also like to say it's very interesting to do this work because I go to Ryerson University. A lot of me coming home is because of my relationship to my university. However, Egerton Ryerson was the person who created the act that ended up creating the residential school system. Also to say that my uncle, who is chief of Tyendinaga Territory, he helped put together a polytechnic, which now has an Aboriginal Foundations course for social work, and then also teaches tech programs. And that is in collaboration with Ryerson University. So although, yeah, moving on, talking about Indigenous children, some of the greatest amounts of federal, provincial, and municipal funding for Indigenous peoples go to child welfare. As an example, in 2020, the federal government gave $542 million to social service bodies to fund the child welfare system. This has historically pulled children out of their homes and placed them in homes that were not culturally appropriate. To continue funding this system is perpetuating the same oppression as what Indigenous peoples faced historically. So we talk about these things on our Orange Shirt Day, or in our classes, speaking about Aboriginal foundations or in groups, but a lot of people don't understand that the same issues just continue to happen. If the government really did want to help Indigenous people, they would have put it into social services that include like food sovereignty or youth homelessness issues, but that's not how it is. And so instead, a lot of people end up houseless or end up in dead-end positions of not being able to provide for their families. Or then also a lot of people have needed to turn their back on understanding their culture. So many of us end up in this place of it's a privilege to understand your culture. And then other people, obviously there's so many different faces of where Indigenous people are at now. Yeah, I'm going to stop on that one. So something that a lot of people do talking about number 6, is that Indigenous people don't pay taxes. And that's actually not true. If you live outside of the reservation, you do pay taxes. You pay municipal for land tax, and you also pay federal taxes. But what happens there is that that money doesn't go back into your home. It doesn't go back into the reserve where your family members may live. Can everyone hear me again?
Yes, my apologies, Miranda.
Okay.
We can hear you.
when did I stop being able to be heard? Does anyone remember what I was saying last?
It was just 2 seconds.
Okay. So just talking about Indigenous people and taxes. And if you live outside of the reserve, you actually do pay taxes. You pay municipal land tax and you pay your federal taxes, but that doesn't go back to your community for drinkable water or other infrastructure that would help Indigenous people have land that and different types of services. And then finally, number 7, many Indigenous peoples are non-status because of the Indian Act, which values paternal bloodlines, even though many Indigenous cultures are matrilineal societies. As a non-status person, you pay taxes whether you live off the res or you don't live on the reserve. And still, the inequalities of infrastructure continue to happen on Indigenous home territories, including like on reserve for drinking water, lack of infrastructure, and so forth. This is a lot, and we can definitely go over a lot more during the question and answer period, because I'm sure there's a lot of things that new learners might not have known. So things to keep in mind when giving a land acknowledgement. Next slide, please. Oh, I guess I forgot to say next slide. So next slide, please.
We're on the slide around Toronto's relationship to Indigenous people. Sorry. Things to keep in mind. Great.
Thank you. So things to keep in mind when giving a land acknowledgement. So going back to our original topic, first and foremost, be authentic. Tell your listener why your land acknowledgement is important to you. Oftentimes we have these mandated land acknowledgements that other people have written for us, and they're not serving to Indigenous peoples or Indigenous communities, and they're really not serving to ourselves. It's not like a truth of the type of relationships that we're holding in our lives or our understanding of issues. So understand, do your research, and tell your listener why your land acknowledgement is important to you. Don't just read it from the paper. And I would definitely suggest, if there is a land acknowledgement that is uniform, to give it a little bit of spice by telling your listeners why you feel it's important to have a land acknowledgement. So again, number 2, do your research on Indigenous peoples prior to giving a land acknowledgement to make sure that your information is correct. Number 3, acknowledge the Indigenous peoples who live there where you are speaking. It's important that this is done regionally, so where you are. Number 4, if you're unsure if your land acknowledgement is correct, find an elder and ask them. And if that's not available, check out resources. There is a resource, it's called Native Land. It's a web tool. It is geolocated at a map of the entire world. And in bubbles, you can find out where you are and who the Indigenous people whose land that traditionally was. So it showcases Indigenous territories globally. Acknowledge that although you may benefit from Canada, and that is a completely different definition for every single person who lives here, because I understand that there are so many injustices and so many inequalities, but many Indigenous people do not benefit from Canada, as we've already spoken about, especially when we're talking about the last slide. And ask yourself, now that I know more about Indigenous peoples, what does that propel me to do? Be involved, maybe do some more research, or get involved with an organization who's working on Indigenous rights. And then tell your audience how your land acknowledgement really does showcase what you think and what that propels you to do. And then finally, be vulnerable. It's an extraordinarily difficult thing to speak in front of groups. And I've definitely, to be my most vulnerable self, I've definitely been shaking this entire seminar, because this is the first time that I'm sharing with a group of people what an experience is. And I'm also representing a lot of humans when I'm talking about this. So to keep that in mind when you're giving a land acknowledgement, and be your most vulnerable self. Finally, I wanted to talk about the dish with one spoon wampum. So the next slide, please. And the dish with one spoon is part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. It was part of when the Confederacy began. They understood that there were 117 principles to live by. This is called the Great Law. And the dish with one spoon is how people came together and decided to share their territory. They decided to share resources, live sustainably on the land, not create war, be peaceful. It stopped war that was already happening on their territories between the 5 nations, and that happened below the Great Lakes. And when people migrated to what is now Toronto and southeastern Ontario, is it southeastern or southwestern? Southwestern Ontario. They took the dish with one spoon with them. So I wanted to bring up Ryerson University's land acknowledgement, because I've heard a lot of activists use this outside of the university itself. Since the university published this acknowledgement, I've heard activist circles and nonprofits use it. So Toronto is the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. That's a true statement. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. That's not an untruth, but I wanted to bring up that Hayden King from Ryerson University's Yellowhead Institute and co-author to the acknowledgement has stated that he regretted writing this acknowledgement. He said, "Who are we to invite anybody into the dish with one spoon wampum?" So as I was speaking before, the dish with one spoon is based on ethics, land and resources, not acting on war, living sustainably. And in order to be in part of that wampum, you need to be living the same ethics. Obviously, what's happened on Toronto soil, on Canadian soil, doesn't reflect that. And it all doesn't reflect 150 years plus where these treaties haven't been respected. So person to person, there's definitely an ability to live those ethics, but it's not just given. Even as an Indigenous person, you need to work towards being the best that you can be and align your life with those principles before you're part of that wampum. So I've been very interested in this land acknowledgement for several years now. And part of the reason why I started with all of these ideas is from being in rooms where people were unable to pronounce the names within the Anishinaabe, the Mississauga, the Haudenosaunee. They weren't able to pronounce that. And then they would say the dish with one spoon as if it's this, it was like a free-for-all for everyone to enjoy this land in the ways that they choose to. And that's not the basis of this wampum. It was to make sure that everyone was upholding their best individual selves and helping one another. So it's not so simple. There's a need for conciliation between settlers, which includes corporations, and the colonial state and Indigenous peoples. It's also really important to mention that Canada has ratified the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Peoples. But even with this, there are many projects happening today that do not prioritize Indigenous rights, and too many Indigenous people end up fighting for their rights to their land, their health, their water resources, fighting against Indigenous injustices. And it's also important to note that many of the youth fighting for their rights will end up with criminal charges because of protecting their land. Protecting or trying to get these resources on their land. And they also face the possibility of being incarcerated. So this adds far more systemic issues, such as debt, lost opportunities, insecurity for their futures for Indigenous youth at this time. So just to be aware of that. Next slide, please. I wanted to play a sound bite. And Teresa, at the bottom of the slide, you'll see the sound bite. I guess if you were to take it off of, oh, actually, maybe I'll just play it. I think this will work out from my side. So just to give it a test, can everyone hear that? Can everyone hear that? Great. Okay.
Blackhawks home game this season. You might recognize some artwork from a Northern Ontario Ojibwe artist. Red Lake's Patrick Hunter designed a digital art piece that appears in the arena during land acknowledgement. Here's a soundbite from that acknowledgement.
The Chicago Blackhawks acknowledge that the team, its foundation, and the spaces we maintain, work, and compete within stand upon the traditional homelands of the Miami, Sauk, Meskwaki, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, and the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. We understand that this land holds immense significance for its original stewards, the Native nations, and the peoples of this region. We would also like to recognize that our team's namesake, Sauk War Leader Blackhawk, serves as a continuous reminder of our responsibility to the Native American communities we live amongst and draw inspiration from.
That land acknowledgement debuted at the end of January. It's part of the Blackhawks' effort in engaging Indigenous-led education, art partnerships, and community development. You might remember a statement from the team last summer in which they said they would stand by their team name while committing to expanding awareness on Indigenous contributions. Up north, Thunder Bay reporter Olivia Levesque spoke with Patrick Hunter about the artwork he developed for the team. She started by asking him about how the partnership came together.
Become like legend or something now, but they just came through my direct messaging through Instagram, and that's kind of, I wish there was a better story than that, but that's how it got started. And it was pretty strange, I think, at first, but then so they have a liaison that she's the one that reached out to me. I agreed to take a phone call with the Blackhawks with kind of a bit of trepidation, only because, you know, I'm Canadian, it's an American sports team. You know, there's all this talk about appropriation, and obviously there's a lot of teams in the United States that kind of do appropriate Native imagery in kind of a not positive way. So I wasn't sure if I was the one that needed to be in that sort of arena, but I think when they had told me there was only 2 other people in the running to do it, and they weren't even sure if they could commit to producing the work in 2 weeks, which is pretty much the amount of time that I had to work with.
Wow. Okay. So a super short amount of time then to produce something like this.
You know, a short amount of time, and then it kind of took up my life for that whole period of less than 2 weeks really, as a creative person, sometimes when you're looking at something for so long, you're like, oh my gosh, like, is this even cool? Are they going to like it? So when I finally sent them the artwork that I was working on, I was like, take it or leave it. I don't know. Like, I hope it's good. And they ended up really liking it a lot and loved the direction I was going in. So that was, that felt amazing.
Yeah. And so this whole project is part of sort of ongoing effort to collaborate with Indigenous and Native American people. So what does that mean to you then to be a part of that and to produce something like that?
Right. Well, right off the bat, I trusted them, and they had a lot of integrity because I feel like, as a national sports team, it's kind of bro-y. Like, they didn't have to take this great step towards reconciliation. I understand that there's a lot of Indigenous people that don't like land acknowledgements, and, all we get is this lousy land acknowledgement sort of rhetoric. And I understand that, but here was an opportunity for a national sports team to take the next step and actually be a template or like a leader to other teams that want to make the same change too, but aren't sure how to do it. And I think that they're doing it in a very cool, positive way.
And so I have your artwork in front of me here that appears in the arena before their home game. So can you kind of walk me through the design and sort of where you drew inspiration from for it and just sort of what it means?
Sure. In, I think, the opening segment, it's a lot of floral work. And I felt like that was sort of more of an iconic view of First Nation culture. Like, I'm Ojibwe, and we do a lot of floral beadwork and stuff like that. So that's sort of where I drew inspiration from that. And being that Chicago is one of the cities around the Great Lakes, Indigenous people would be traveling around trading, things that had floral patterns on them, clothing or things that are used like pouches and things like that. And I just wanted something that a lot of people could digest and understand that this came from around this area. The team as well also wanted me to just reflect my own art style. Instead of trying to make it look like it was someone else's or make it look like it could be, found around Chicago on one of the First Nations there. And then the second sort of bit of artwork that you see is a bunch of kind of like shark feathers. And those represent a lot of the First Nations that are around the city of Chicago. And the Black Hawk himself, because he was a real person, so he's represented in there as well. And yeah, it kind of ties into the 7 grandfather teachings because there's 7 feathers. And I just love the way that they kind of displayed them on all the screens throughout the whole building. I think like 70,000 people fit in there when it's not during COVID time. So there will be a lot of eyes on it as soon as they can reopen.
Yeah.
Just want to stop it there. So there's a long history of appropriation, especially with sports teams. They've had with appropriating Indigenous symbols, such as the Chiefs, or there's a few Canadian universities who had a long time appropriated Indigenous symbols as their icons and their sports identity. So what Patrick was saying, they didn't need to do this. They didn't need to take a step towards reconciliation. And he also said that they're quite bro-y. So there wasn't this expectation that they would ever wisen up. So even with that, though, listening to their land acknowledgement, talking about the traditional territories of those people, but not bringing in really what is happening now with those people. I just wanted to repeat to you one more time the land acknowledgement that I created for this presentation for the PODS project if they choose to use it. Next slide, please. So I'll just read you that again to reiterate everything that I've just spoken about for the last almost hour, and for you to start your own journey into land acknowledgements. And so the land acknowledgement itself says, I would like to acknowledge that Toronto was built upon the lands of the Mississauga, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, the Wendat, and many other Indigenous peoples. I would like to acknowledge that Canada was founded as a trade and commerce economy that continues to affect the lives and well-being of Indigenous peoples, putting economic greed in front of Indigenous rights. For that reason, I would like to recognize that the invaluable work happening in the Mutual Aid's PODS project, as it's based in the Indigenous cultural worldview of kinship, taking care of your community, and giving what you have to others who may have less. Although we're doing this work on Toronto soil, it's important to acknowledge that there is a long way to go before conciliation can occur between the City of Toronto and Indigenous peoples. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge that many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island live in Toronto. I would like to value their diversity of cultural worldviews, their resiliency, and their ties to their community. So I've devised some questions that as a group we can go through. So next slide, please. The first question is, how are the land acknowledgements written for this class and the acknowledgement written for the Blackhawks, which we heard on the audio bite, different? And what are their similarities? And how could the Blackhawks land acknowledgement be changed to identify modern Indigenous issues around Chicago? Finally, what would you do differently when giving a land acknowledgement, now that you know what you've heard in this session, when it comes to devising a land acknowledgement in Toronto? What would you do differently? So I think with that, we're gonna do small breakout groups.
Thank you so much, Miranda, for sharing all that really, really critical information in such a caring and thoughtful way, really grounding our discussion. And